Hello, my name is Ramon Valdez, and I'm going to show you how to cut beautiful, perfect fitting miters with a chop saw. You're probably thinking, who's this guy? Miters with a chop saw. We already do that. Well, maybe you do, maybe you don't. Let me show you what I'm talking about. All right, so when I say beautiful, perfect fitting miters, I don't mean miters that look okay. I mean miters, when looked under magnification, they are perfect. The bottom is tight, the top is tight, the profiles match, and these are cut in aspen. It's a good substitute for holly. It's extremely white wood, and there's no place to hide when cutting miters with this light of a species. Okay, so check it out, and I'll show you more of this here in a bit. See that? Tight, right? Not close, no putty, no sawdust and glue, that really bothers me. I wish people would quit propagating sawdust and glue. Just learn to cut better quality joints and quit trying to fill them with wood filler, right? Now, if this was walnut or a darker species, yeah, you can get away with a bit more. But when it's white wood like this, like I said, there is no room for error, no place to hide. Let me show you how I do this. So of course it needs to start with a good quality saw, and I know they make more expensive saws than this. This is the DeWalt DW705. It's not a slider, which means less moving parts. So this arm is very rigid. It's not belt drive, so this motor, it's not direct drive, but it is nearly in line with the blade. So you have very little run out. The stops are positive, and overall, a very accurate saw, one that I've been using for over 20 years. When I say accurate setup, there's a lot of checks that you can do. First and foremost, you should make sure that your fence is straight. You can use a high quality straight edge to check that. Even though this fence is one piece, it can still be slightly tweaked and made straight if it's not. Of course, it needs to be square this way. The saw needs to be cutting 45 degrees this way. It should be cutting 90 degrees this way. The blade should be 90 degrees this way. All these checks. I have another video that talks about doing all of that, and there's tons of information out on the web. So for this video, I'm just going to assume that your saw is cutting as accurately as possible, right? Now you see I have this sacrificial board clamped, and yeah, it's pretty chewed up. I need to make another one. Incidentally, I have written on here, make 3-inch tall, which I normally make them 3-inch tall. But the last time I made this, I had this piece. I thought, well, that'll work. And then I remembered there's a reason I make it 3-inch tall. So my clamps will reach and still give me a place for the trim or whatever I'm cutting to go underneath. This will serve a couple of purposes. One, it's going to give you a zero clearance on the bottom of the cut and on the back. And B, it gives you a perfect place to line up your marks. So let me move the camera and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So I'm working on what at first blush looks like a relatively simple box, and it is. However, with miters, there are 8 cuts, and each one of those has to be exact. If your saw is off by half a degree, well, that is 4 degrees off total by the time you get done. So accuracy is extremely important. So I'm going to show you how I mark and why I mark the way I do. To start, I'll take a length of trim, or like this piece here was about 4 feet long, and I'll cut a miter on one end. I have it marked here. This designates the top, and this designates the edge that goes against this particular piece. That way, if it did count, you could index most of your corners. In other words, the grain would match from miter to miter. Now, what I'm going to show you involves just a high quality chop saw. However, you can make that even better by using a shooting board and a shooting plane, and I'll talk about that in a bit. So to start, we make one miter, we put it in place, we line up this corner, right? Pretty straightforward. And then I'm using a 0.3 millimeter pencil. That lead is tiny, and I can mark the length right here on this end. Now, here's the beauty of this sacrificial backup piece. I can start by making a cut at a 45. And now I know this is my reference for this line that I made. There's my line. I can bring it. Oops, clamps in the way. Remember that. Move that up just a little. There we go. I can line up that line exactly with that cut in the sacrificial piece. Boom. That is going to cut right on that line or even split that 0.3 millimeter line. That is fabulous. Now I know what some of you are thinking. Well, you're cutting your miters backwards. Am I? A lot of people think that I should cut the miter like this, right? And the saw comes down. Well, my buddy David Bedrosian had an excellent analogy because I'm always talking about cutting with the grain. This applies to table saw and especially here at the miter saw. If I'm cutting like this, that blade is going with the grain, not against it. You can see as those teeth are rotating down, they are cutting into the grain here. And David's analogy was a paintbrush. You can see these would mimic the wood fibers. You're cutting against them, right? This way, you're cutting with them. It's a cleaner cut. A lot of people would assume that this back edge would splinter out. Well, that's the reason for the zero clearance. The front edge also needs to be clean, right? If I cut it this way without a zero clearance or a sacrificial piece, this back edge would inevitably splinter out and it would show up. So I start by making a clean cut, just like that. Then I can rotate this after I make a mark, line up these marks with this cut. I know exactly where it's going to cut, and it's going to produce another clean, accurate miter.
Incidentally, my favorite blade and the one I'm using here is a 96 tooth with an ATB grind, which stands for alternate top bevel. Blade manufacturers will routinely recommend a triple chip grind, but they don't cut nearly as cleanly as an ATB. They may last longer, but nothing beats an ATB grind.
You'll notice that as I fired up the saw, I let the motor come up to full speed before I begin the cut. Also, I just bring that saw without flexing it to the right or left. I've seen people make cuts and they're like, why is this saw cutting like that? I'm like, well, let me watch your technique. And they were literally pulling the saw over. I mean, yeah, it's rigid, but it still has flex. All those things add up. So there's our cut. Just left the line. Okay, here we go. These cuts are straight off the saw. They are perfect. This is actually the top. Showing you this on white wood, so there is no hiding, right? Now, we're going to make this even better, which is why I left a little bit of the length. This piece here, I left a little bit of the line. We're going to clean that up, get rid of any of these saw marks with a shooting board and a shooting plane. You can see these saw marks if you put a low raking light. I think that'll show. It might show. Very subtle. It's a pretty quality blade. I'll talk about that in a bit, but let's go ahead and clean that up. All right, this is a high quality shooting board. I apologize to inform you that the person that made this, Tico Vote, he no longer makes them, but there's still good quality shooting boards out there, or you could take the time and make one yourself. I love this one because of its adjustability, and it's just a pleasure to use. Good quality shooting plane. This one is made by Veritas. Love this thing. So we're gonna bring our miter. I'm gonna put it right against this. Just butt it right up to the sole. And we'll just make a couple of slices. 1, 2. You can see, I think you can see this clear, shiny area. That's where the knives cut. A little bit dull right here. So one more swipe. Boom. That is a clean, beautiful, perfect miter.
And here you can see, I think you can see, we've literally split that line in half. So we've taken a 0.3 millimeter line, split it in half to 0.15. That's accurate, yeah?
Let's see how it looks. And just slide those inside the corner. It's lined up perfectly. That is nice and tight. Let's look at the other side. All right, so I'm going to continue with these cuts. I'm going to get these all cut and in place, and I'll show you the results. Another thing you may have noticed is that I'm not moving the miter position, right? I'm just keeping it in the same position. There's no need for me to move from left to a right miter. So this is the sequence of cuts. Check it out. What's cool about this is that now that I need to make this cut this way so that this grain stays indexed, is that I can line up this back cut or maybe cut just a little bit off that to start a new fresh corner. And I can line it up with this part of the zero clearance backsplash, I guess we could call it. Right there like that. It's simply a rinse and repeat situation. All right, a couple of other things that'll make a big difference. And so you can see I have this piece elevated so I can, I don't want to put this on upside down. I won't be able to see the part that's going to show, which is the top. And I have this first piece. It's clamped in place, no glue. It's dead flush. I've got that tightened. This miter lines up perfectly because I can bring this piece that I'm going to be gluing first, and that looks great. I have this fall off piece, and I can check this, or I can just merely look and see that that's going to line up. So by clamping this in place, I can glue this first one using this as my reference, and then start gluing all the others using the last one that I put in place as my reference. Additionally, since this bottom of this lid has been sanded, I don't want any glue migrating down underneath. If it comes out on top, not a big deal. That's all going to get sanded flush with all this veneer. You can see there's glue on here. None of this has really been sanded. I've just taken off most of the glue, but this marquetry and this top surface hasn't been flushed up. I'll do that after all the edges are put on. So to keep that glue from migrating down, does that show up? I've got this little glue groove here, right? It's just about the thickness of this panel. You can see I've cut that little groove on all the pieces, right? And all I did was tilt my saw blade at the table saw at 45 degrees, and I cut a shallow glue groove. So as I apply glue here at the top and just a little bead here near this groove, I'll put this in place. And I'm not just going to plop that on this way. I'll put it like this and squeegee the glue upwards. Any glue that wants to migrate down is going to be stopped by this little groove. And of course, that groove is high enough to where it won't show from underneath. All those little details, yeah, they do add up. So what I'll do is I'll just put one on and I'll literally just let it tack up for about 5 minutes, go do something else, come back, put on another one, go work on something else, chase all the way around. It's a very effective way to get foolproof miters.
I find this to be the easiest way to cut the little glue groove. I simply lay the blade over to a 45-degree angle, let it protrude about 1 millimeter or a little less than a 1/16, and simply make the cut.
All right, so here's something to think about. So what if you're putting miters around a piece and you cut one just a tad too short? The miters are clean and perfect, but overall the length is too short. Well, here's something that you could do. So think about it like this. If this material, let's just say for this application that this is 1/2 inch, let's say it's 12.7 millimeters thick, 1/2 inch thick. And that means from this short part of the miter to the long part of the miter is also 12.7 or 1/2 inch, right? So if this is too short, we could just take a hand plane or whatever you have and shave this interface. By doing that, you've essentially made these miters shorter, but this face longer, and now it should reach. That may not always be the right solution, but oftentimes it does work. In this situation, since there's already a profile on there, yeah, it would throw it off a tiny amount. Since I'm using a hand plane, it's minuscule, but the length happens quickly since it adds it to both miters, right? In this case, it would absolutely work because I'm going to be putting this profile on afterwards. So I'll exaggerate this for clarity, but let's say that we take some of this inside face off, and when we put the miters together, they end up like that. Does that show up? Again, exaggerated for clarity. So after all the trim is on, I can reduce this face and then add my profile, and everything's going to work out perfectly. Always solutions, right? Sometimes being as careful as you can be and accurate, things still happen. I mean, we are working with wood, right? So when I'm putting this piece in place, I'm noticing that this quite doesn't close at the top. Get that situated. Here we go. A little bit of a gap at the top, and it's tight at the bottom for some reason, right? And I don't want to force that. So I'm just going to cut a little bit off the bottom of this miter. So I have these shims, and they just consist of layers of tape, right? 5 layers, 3 layers, 7 layers, whatever, right? And this piece, we needed to cut a little bit more off the bottom. So let me just mark that all the way across. Here's my target area that needs a little bit more taken off. So what I can do is just put a shim there, put that in place. You can literally see it. There's a little bit of a gap at the top. It's tight at the bottom. So I know it's going to be cutting this area. Simple, maybe crude, but effective. You can see a pencil line disappeared there. I don't want to take too much. Let me try that.
So apparently I didn't get a shot of that, but the little tape tip did the trick.
Well, there's all the edges put on. I'm going to sand this, get everything flush, not finish sand, just get everything flush. Then I can clean up the edges, make sure they all line up on the corners. And then at that point, I will put the profile, this profile all around the perimeter. And I can get these areas flush and put a finish on it.
Well, then a final sand, then a finish. Well, surprise, surprise. The fastest way for me to do this is by utilizing a belt sander, probably with like a 150 or 180 grit. When sanding something small like this, I have a preferred approach. I like the belt sander to hang off the front. That's why here I turn it around. I have a lot of belt sander tips and tricks. I'll leave a link in the description. And of course, here I'm marking a couple of places I may have missed. That way I don't oversand areas that don't need more sanding. And I always check with a low raking light.
So at this point, I'm just making sure that the miters match on the outside. You know, you just take off more material so they come to a perfect apex.
I always route outdoors if I can. It's just, well, you don't have to clean up such a mess, right? And you'll notice I'm doing all climb cuts to start, and then I finish with conventional pass, just to make sure I don't have any blowouts. The bottom edges were slightly off, so a quick way to get them all even and flush over at the table saw. Quick, easy. You can see the blade is just slightly high, just enough to make the cut. As is standard with many of my projects, I do one pass with a belt sander with maybe 150, 180 grit, even 120 at times, and then a final finish sand with probably 180 with a DA. And I'm done.
All right, here's the lid, sanded, ready just for final sanding around the perimeter on this profile. Check out those miters. Beautiful, clean, tight. You get them that tight and white, that is a good miter. Check out the bottom. That one's invisible. You can see that one hairline. Seems like the bottom or the back always comes out better. Yeah, man, that's how you do it. That's how I do it.
At this point, I remember the customer had called me. They were in a big hurry and wanted to pick up the box that day. So I ended up using like an oil finish on the inside, and I decided to use a lacquer on the outside. And so I just wanted to mask everything off. So I went and get lacquer on the inside of the box, and this is just a quick way to do that. And if I remember correctly, I used 2 coats of Osmo on the inside and the bottom of the lid. The outside got 2 seal coats and 1 final top coat of lacquer, which is pretty typical for me. You can check out my 2 latest YouTube videos all about spray finishing. Here's a finished project. Check out those outside miters, beautiful, tight, clean, all that, right? This small box is actually an urn, and when the customer first talked to me, they were going to bury it. They decided not to once they saw it, which is always good. Letters were created with hand-cut marquetry. The cross was created with the Shaper Origin. Anyway, rest in peace, Brother Chris. And that's the video. Thank you so much for watching. And remember, click, like, subscribe, learn.